Hello, hello. Welcome to Discord Q&A number 33. Nothing really else to say, so let's get right in there. Starting out, we've got should Diadem be reshaped? And the proposal here was higher cooldown and healing per proc, and then make it scale with percent current mana. So I'll divide these into two categories, and I'll talk about Diadem generally. So the first one, higher cooldown and healing per proc. This is something I've considered quite a bit. Specifically, is something that I had in my release plan for the item if the synergy with systemic healing effects was too high, such that the item couldn't be tuned. I don't think we're quite there, right? It's definitely very powerful when combined with specifically Echoes of Helia, but even in other modes, right? Like look at Mayhem, for example. It's actually quite popular. The item is more popular in Mayhem because it interacts with a lot of the augments that trigger off of heal shield. You think of things like Sonic Boom or whatever, right? And even some of the other items that are just more commonly purchased in all the alternate modes. Things like Ardent Censer and Staff of Flowing Waters. It just gives you high uptime on those. I think that this item having high synergy with those things does not bother me. And as it stands right now, there's a little bit of evidence that suggests that the synergy with Echoes of Helia is limiting how powerful that diadem can be, but it's not conclusive, right? And it could just be that we could just maybe buff diadem, and maybe have it be a bit stronger and featured in a few more enchanter builds. I don't think currently there's an overwhelming mountain of evidence that suggests that it must be a higher cooldown, or sorry, a slower proc rate, and similar or more healing per second throughput. uh I do think there's some value in it being really consistent, right? It gives you something that you can see. It gives you, something like, even if it's not that much healing on each individual proc, it's like, well, you can look at it and say, oh, look, my item is doing something, right? I can understand what it's doing. And I do think there's also some value to letting enchanters feel like they're like assembling the like Rube Goldberg machine of the diadem plus the echoes plus sometimes like Moonstone. I think can even really add to that, like making you feel like you're building a machine in your item slots. I think there's something cool about that, and part of what's cool about it is how consistent it is. And so if we were to say, double or triple the amount of time it takes to get a proc, that's going to make the item less like harder to interpret, like harder to understand what it's actually doing, even if the individual healing procs are larger. Also, one thing I don't like about the larger healing procs, which I've tried on items before, not this one specifically. I'm pretty sure in dev I always had this one at triggering every 1 second. But one thing I don't like about items that are automatic that provide larger chunky heals is that can be much more difficult for opponents to interpret, right? Like you imagine you're playing against a Sona or whatever, and you hit someone down to a low amount of HP, they're about to die to your next auto attack, and then they just happen to receive what feels like a fairly random like big chunky heal for like 100 or whatever from this item. That doesn't really feel like it's a super earned, like, oh, they survived the next auto attack because this heal just came in just in time. Whereas I think the more consistent sort of drip of healing that it does right now every 1 second, it's more consistent, it's more predictable, and I think it does feel a lot more understandable and earned. And it's much less likely to produce those scenarios where like someone survives your spell that was in a way that was unexpected, or someone survives your uh auto attack or whatever in a way that's unexpected. Because when that thing happens, I think it is usually like optimal that a player action caused that to happen, right? Like that happening because the enemy Sona pressed W and shielded them and healed them, I think is great, right? Like, oh, okay, the enemy Sona did an action, or the enemy Janna shielded them or whatever, right? Like there's a clear correlation of player action to the output. But I think when we have these automatic items that are doing this on their own, it's a little bit different, where I don't love when those things have like big impacts on fights that aren't super understandable, like going into that interaction. So overall, I guess my response to the first part is we could do higher cooldown, or like hard, lower rate of triggering and higher healing per proc. I suspect that the item starts being not very interesting and like breaking down some of the things that it's supposed to do if it's less frequent than like every other second, right? I think going to triggering every other second rather than every second is probably well within bounds, but I suspect less frequently than that we start probably running into problems around like the chunkiness of the heal, and like how that warps combat, and like that feeling unearned and unexpected in a lot of ways, and like distorting combat in ways that probably aren't super desirable because of how chunky it is. But I'm not personally opposed to like, potentially going to once every 2 seconds if we had more evidence that that was actually like a super meaningful problem, that it was like only buildable with echoes, which I don't think, again, currently I think we have a small amount of evidence that that might be true, but we could also try buffing Diadem, seeing what happens, seeing if there are other builds that emerge, because I think in its current form right now, it's pretty clearly not one of the stronger enchanter items. It's like functional. I think it's pretty mediocre, in terms of power. It's like it clearly works, but it clearly has a really powerful synergy with echoes. That's fine, right? Lots of items have really powerful synergies. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be reshaped away from those synergies. Sometimes that can be healthy. It doesn't always have to be, though. Now, the second part of this question is something that I do have a lot of thoughts on, which is making it scale with percent current mana. This is a line of thinking that I also had when I was making this item. I was like, oh, it's really interesting if the item scales with percent current mana, because then that really rewards you for building mana regeneration, right? It gives it a clear synergy across the item system that it's in. Because one of the things that's a little bit weird about the way the Diadem works is that it's a tier item in a system that is about percent mana regen, like percent increased mana regen. And so the fact that it has a lot of flat mana is a little bit weird, right? It doesn't really fit super effectively into the system that it's in. And there's some synergies that it has with items in other systems, right? Like other tier items, for example, like Seraphs, right? Like some Sonas just buy both, which I think is cool. Anyway, uh, I was on the same line of thinking when I tested prototypes of this item, which is why I've tried versions that scaled with percent current mana, versions that consumed a percent of your current mana, in order to heal, and then they would turn off at certain like lower thresholds of your mana. I tried a bunch of different versions of this, and the conclusion that I came to pretty definitively was that this is not good. And the reason why that is that while there's a lot of theoretical, like intellectual satisfaction around, like, oh, it rewards you for staying at high mana, and it makes you feel good about stacking lots of mana regeneration in your other slots so that you can stay at higher levels of mana. And it will create contextual differences between builds that build a bunch of flat mana because they'll run out of mana versus builds that build a lot of mana regeneration, which will have more consistently high heals. The problem with this is that ultimately, people don't like being like feeling like casting their spells is wrong. And part of the point of Diadem, like building a tier item, like part of the point of building a tier item in the first place for most champions is that you don't have to really think about your mana at all afterwards, right? Once you've transformed your tier item, there's very few champions that really care about their mana afterwards, right? Like, yes, there's like Cassidon and Anivia and like Ziggs to a lesser extent, where it's like, yeah, you can still yourself because you have like a ramping mana cost, or your mana costs are just completely insane. But especially for enchanters, part of the promise of building a tier item is that you don't have to think about your mana anymore. And then having current mana scaling on this item, the feedback I got very consistently, both internal feedback and when we had this item in player labs, was I don't want to feel like casting my spells is wrong when I build a tier item. Basically, I think part of the implicit promise of a tier item for enchanters is you don't have to worry about whether casting your spell, like whether the mana cost on your spells being meaningful. What you should be thinking about is the cooldowns on your spells. Like, is it a good time to cast my shield? Is it a good time to cast my Soraka Q, etc.? But when I had this version, like these versions of Diadem that cared about how much current mana you had, very consistently people felt bad about casting their spells, even if the actual real like meaningful difference was not that big, right? Like between it was like, oh, you cast a few spells that were bad and now you're healing for 25 instead of 27, right? And it's like, well, it actually doesn't matter what the number difference is. People still felt bad about it, and so I'm pretty confident that this is supposed to be max mana scaling and not consume your mana, because the reality is just the feedback I got on the current mana version was just so much worse, right? As soon as I changed this to max mana, instantly the feedback improved significantly. I mean, the feedback wasn't like terrible. People weren't telling me like it was like an awful item. It was just, hey, this item is cool, but I don't like the current mana thing, was pretty consistently the feedback, again, both internally and from the player labs feedback. And so changing it to max mana scaling just resolved a lot of those issues pretty immediately. And again, I don't think this is an unreasonable stance to have. I had the same line of thinking when I was making this item, and so uh, it's not an unreasonable thought to have, like, oh, it'll like really tie it into the system that it's in, and it'll make it interesting, how you build around this item. But you also have to just consider like the psychology of like how it interacts with like people thinking about their mana costs and how people think about using their spells in game. And so ultimately that's kind of where we ended up was, yep, it should just be max mana scaling. You should not have to worry about how much mana you have, and the heal should just be very consistent. And I think that's generally all good. And so that's where I am at on Diadem is basically if I were summarizing it, um, maybe we should make it trigger every other second instead of every second. That'll make it a little bit worse at interacting with some of those systems. But and it could have the same healing throughput. But I think there are limits to how low we can go on that part. And then percent current mana scaling, tried it, don't think it's good. Pretty consistently, I think feedback showcased that that's not something that we want to do. Is Banshees dangerous for the game if it's good? Is it purposefully treated different from Zonia's? So let's divide these into two separate questions and talk to the first one first. Is it dangerous for the game if it's good? I don't know if dangerous is the right term to use here. I think one of the parallels that I have, there's a few problems I think with Banshees and a few reasons why I generally don't believe that it should be one of the stronger AP items. I have no problem with it being a good, effective, purchasable AP item. But if I were saying like, okay, we're gonna stack rank the AP items into tiers, I would like, and the tiers are going to directly correspond to like how powerful we're going to tune them. I would never put Banshees in the top one because of some of the problems that it creates. Let me give an example, an illustrative example first, and then talk about some of the cases, like some of the use cases we've seen for Banshees in the past 5 to 6 years when it's been more powerful. One of the example cases I use here that I think is really, really effective is the old Abyssal Scepter, right? One of the main problem with the old Abyssal Scepter, it had other problems, but one of the main problems with the old Abyssal Scepter was, which for those of you not familiar, was an AP plus MR item that basically said there's an aura around you that reduces enemy MR by a flat amount. And one of the main problems with it was if your opponent bought an Abyssal Scepter and you wanted to interact with them at all, you pretty much also had to buy an Abyssal Scepter, right? Because it was shredding flat MR and it gave MR. And so if you're, AP versus AP, you really had no way of dealing, like you had no way of overcoming them. Even if you were ahead of them, they would just beat you, like hard stat check you in the 1v1 in a lot of, matchups, even matchups where you wouldn't expect that to happen because it was scaling on so many vectors. It's like shredding your flat MR. So if you didn't have any MR, you would get, you'd be taking really big damage, and it was giving them a bunch of MR against your damage. And the build path was incredible, right? It had a Negatron cloak. Not all of these things are true for Banshees, but some of them are, right? Just like by virtue of being an AP plus MR item, you are like any item that we make in that space is potentially at risk of being a parasitic item where the best counter to that item is to also buy that item. And that's really dangerous, right? This is one of the reasons why, as an example, we don't have an armor on hit item in the game. We've tried some of them before, like we've tried prototypes. And I do believe that there are versions of it that wouldn't have this problem, like versions of that kind of thing that wouldn't have this problem. But one of the risks that we've seen when we've made previous prototypes of armor on hit items is, comparable to like Wit's End for armor, is that the answer to that item becomes also buying that item, right? Like an 80 carry, so you have like Varus versus Callista bot lane or something like that. Varus starts building the armor on hit item. Callista feels pressured, like, oh man, I can't interact with this guy if I don't also buy the armor on hit item, right? Banshees does this to a lesser extent, and it's not quite as bad because in the current game, the way that it's shaped, it's often a second item in these situations, and so it's a lesser version of that effect, but it still does manifest, especially because there are a lot of cases where if you're playing mage versus mage, you'll get pushed out of mid lane and you'll have to side lane against each other either in top or in bot lane. And so your second items actually end up mattering for the purposes of the 1v1 more than you might expect from a sort of theoretical perspective, where it's like, well, the laning phase is over after you finish your first item a lot of the time. That is true, but also a lot of the time as a mage, especially if you're AP versus AP, you're gonna be interacting with the other AP champion in the side lane. Not literally every single game, but a lot of the time you will be in optimized play, and even in unoptimized play where people don't swap you out in mid lane. You're just going to be laning against the other mage. You're going to be playing Xerath versus Victor mid or whatever for an extended period of time after the laning phase ends. So anyway, basically some of the things that we want to avoid here around item optimizations and like your opponent being able to like force you into buying an entire Banshees, like in order to be able to interact with them at all, are not super desirable. And I think again, I would say dangerous isn't really the word that I would use, but I would say it's an item that I would not generally want to be one of the like most powerful AP items, right? I think there are some cases, like there are lots of items in different systems that I look at and I'm like, yeah, I don't think that should be one of the best items in this system. I think that's fine, right? Like that's totally fine that we have items that we don't necessarily want to be the most powerful in each individual system, right? I think another good example of something like this would be like Fiend Hunter Bolts, which I made more recently. It's like I don't think that Fiend Hunter Bolts should be the best Zeal item, like the most factually powerful Zeal item. That probably should be Phantom Dancer most of the time, right? Maybe Rudance. Um, I also think, for what it's worth, RFC generally shouldn't be the most powerful Zeal item. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? Like around how those items compress and manifest their power. Not going to get into all of that, but generally speaking, just the way that Banshees manifests its power, part of it is that it's a big AP, big MR item, and that means that it can sort of parasitically force people into builds that might not be super desirable to be forced in the game. Whereas Zhonya's doesn't have this problem, partially because it's an AP armor item. And its effect is also a lot sharper, where the Banshee's effect is kind of uh, in some ways higher variance because it's more likely to get knocked off, but it's just more of the power of Banshees is in the stats rather than the actual unique effect that it has. And so Zhonya's kind of gets away with some of these things, partially because the active effect has a lot of variance as well, and it occupies a lot more power. And, again, it's not an APMR item, and so it doesn't create the same parasitic issue where, like, oh, your opponent forces you into buying this item by also buying this item. Is it purposefully treated different from Zhonya's? I've talked about this a little bit. As like, yes, to some extent, yes. Like partially, it's just Banshees is a more stat oriented item, right? Whereas Zhonya's is a more unique oriented item. In fact, they're actually, I think, pretty good examples of like not necessarily exact opposite ends of the spectrum. I think Zhonya's is probably on one end of the spectrum. It's definitely one of the top items in the game in terms of less power in the stats and most of the power of like the power budget. Maybe not most isn't right the word, but like the highest percentage of power budget amongst items is in the unique effect, right? The active amongst items. Whereas Banshees is like on the lower end of most of the power of the item is in the stats, which does exacerbate this issue because part of the problem with it is that it is like the stats on the item, the combination of stats that it has do cause some problems in some situations. One of the things I'll point out, this isn't necessarily a problem with the current version of Banshees, but one of the things we saw with prior versions of Banshees that were tuned to be quite powerful was optimized players, especially in AP versus AP matchups, when they got ahead, would just go Banshees second, partially because of how cheap it was and it was offering a really fast spike, and that would like allow them to take over the game. But also the spell shield effect is actually much better used offensively than defensively. It's something that's very like a little like very very weird about the way that the spell shield presents itself is that it kind of presents itself as like, oh, this is going to protect you from a thing. Like it's going to make it so that it's safe for you to sit back and you can't get randomly blasted by ash arrow or whatever, right? But the actual reality is that the aggressive use cases for the spell shield are a lot better, because when you are like an echo or someone and you just show up on someone's face and they are forced to deal with the spell shield before they can use their like CC spells on you, that's a way more powerful use case for a spell shield than being Xerath and sitting at 1,000 range until you eventually get hit by an Ash W or whatever, and your spell shield gets knocked off. Because the longer range champions that are looking to persist and stay around for a while and get value out of the spell shield, they're eventually going to get hit by a spell, right? Whereas conversely, the like lower range champions that go in with the spell shield, they will force their opponents to make a choice about like how they're going to use that their spells to break the spell shield in that moment, because they're picking and choosing the moment when they go in, and they have a lot more agency over the spell. So this is why I think Edge of Night is generally a much more powerful version of the spell shield than Banshees, even though they're exactly the same from a gameplay perspective. The class that uses them is different, and they leverage that spell shield very differently, which is why Edge of Night is a reasonably popular item. It's it's like there's a lot of assassins that are like excited to buy Edge of Night, in the third or fourth slot, whereas there's not a lot of mages that are super excited about buying Banshee's Veil, and there's some AP assassins that are moderately excited about it later on in their slots. Anyway, I've spun off on this a bit, but ultimately, I guess if I'm summing up my answers to these two questions, Number one, dangerous isn't the term that I would use. I do generally think that I don't like think that Banshees probably shouldn't be one of the most powerful AP items in the game. Like I think if it was top five, for example, amongst AP items in terms of raw power, that's probably not a good end state for the game because that's going to create some uh, undesirable game states and undesirable decision points for people around when they can or should buy Banshee's Veil, especially because of like people being able to like, especially the ahead person being able to force their opponent into buying a Banshee's. And is it treated different from Zonia's? Yes, but only insofar I think as Zonia's doesn't have the same stat combination problem that Banshee's does, and Zonia's has a lot more percentage of its power budget loaded into its active, which is more in the player's control, especially in the defensive use cases, which I think is why these items end up being treated fairly differently. Because Banshees is just so much more power loaded into the stats, and it's a more risky, I would say, sort of problematic-ish combination of stats. Does Olaf need passive armor and MR on ulti still? I think my short answer to this question is no. I don't think he needs it. I don't think it's bad, right? Like, to be clear about the distinction between this version of Olaf and previous versions, the current version of Olaf, the main core counterplay to the ultimate is supposed to be spacing the Olaf and not getting hit by him, right? Because the current version, the core difference between the current version of Olaf and the previous version of his ultimate is the current version has a much lower base duration, but it can be extended by Olaf hitting people. The previous version had like a higher base duration, couldn't be extended, and so the counterplay was intended, like the main core counterplay was not intended to be space Olaf. That was secondary counterplay. You could still do that, right? But the main counterplay, especially in larger scale fights, was supposed to be kill this guy right now. If he can't kill you first, he's losing his resistances in his ultimate, right? And so one of the reasons why he still keeps the resistances in the ultimate today is that kill this guy immediately type counterplay isn't the supposed to be the primary counterplay to Olaf's ultimate now, right? Like it's supposed to be spacing him, which is just a bit of a shift in how we constructed the champion, right? And I actually like the current version of Olaf more than the previous version, like in terms of the design construction of like the play and counterplay to his spells. I think that works like quite well, but the armor and MR on the ultimate is still left over, like it's still around. I don't think that it's something that's like core to the character that could never be stripped, right? As an example, if someone wanted to remove it and like buff something else, or like even just give him the same sort of thing back, as an example, like we could remove the armor and MR on his ultimate and just give him more armor and MR per level, as an example. I think that would be totally fine. Alternately, we could like just give him, we could take this mechanic off and like buff his W, or something like that, or just generally make him a little bit more durable, or buff him in some other area. I think defensive stuff is nice. But one of the things that this does do for us, like specifically the fact that it's armor and MR that spikes on your ult ranks, is it does mean that health is good and levels are really good, right? It means that hitting those level breakpoints is important, and Olaf cares a lot about hitting, 6, 11, and 16, which I think is upside, right? Like to me, that seems good. And while I don't think that need is the right word, I don't think these are really doing a ton of harm. Like, would Olaf be a better champion if we found a like slightly better place to put these, like this defensive effect that scales your, health purchases? Probably, right? Like, but it's a pretty marginal improvement. And this is kind of one of those things where I look at it and I say, well, I guess if we were already doing Olaf work, maybe it would be good to change this. But it's one of those things where I kind of look at it and I just say, it just wouldn't be worth on its own the cost of change here, right? Like every change we make to the game has some risk, right? Has some cost of change. And so I look at this and I say, yeah, if we were doing Olaf work, sure. Like let's change this up. Otherwise, I think it's fine, right? It's not doing harm really. I think it's a fine mechanic for him to have, giving him greater synergy with health, and just giving him a little bit more interest in hitting those ult level breakpoints. Sure, right? But does he need it? No, I don't think that he does. Why are jungle camp spawn timers slower now versus previous seasons? Fun fact, they're actually both slower and faster than previous seasons because we've had them both faster and slower prior to the current camp spawn timers, which are 2 minutes and 15 seconds. And I think Scuttle is 2 minutes and 30 seconds, actually. I think it's slightly offset. Anyway, so we've had them slower and faster in the past. What we have them at right now is a pretty finely tuned version of the jungle where we have the camps set up in such a way that the typical jungler clearing at a normal pace, right, will have downtime on their camps, but not a ton of downtime. Essentially, what we've tried to create, like this was a very intentional thing that we've done in the past. When we were designing previous versions of the jungle, right? This hasn't happened in quite some time. We haven't done significant jungle work in quite a while, but in previous versions of the jungle, we were very intentional to create uh, downtime where none of your camps are up. One of the problems that we've run into in versions of the jungle where your camps are always up because the spawn timers are very fast is that the decision making is very unclear. It's it becomes very difficult for jungle players, even some people who've played a lot of jungle, to understand when they should be doing what. Now, there are some upsides to faster spawn can timers, right? Don't get me wrong. I think that, like from a personal perspective, I think that if we could find a way for faster spawn timers to work, that'd be great. But there is a really massive advantage that we get by having about 250 and the tuning on the jungle camps that with clear times that we have right now, which is that there is a clear moment of downtime for junglers where it is very understandable that they should do something on the map, right? And then we can tie a lot of our rules on the jungle item to basically say most of the time you want to be clearing, and then there are clear windows of time when it is powerful for you to take a gank. Doesn't mean that you can't gank outside of that time. You can make get yourself into that more complex decision making space around, I'm going to skip this camp for a gank, or I'm going to skip my bot side, or I'm going to vertical jungle, or I'm going to vertical one camp, or I'm going to counter jungle like their raptors or whatever, and then I'm going to go for this mid lane play or whatever, right? Like all of that, like more complex decision making that that exists in the really really fast respawn timers. So that stuff still exists if you want to opt into that, but there is a more straightforward and understandable baseline of the jungler very clearly has a moment of time to act where they are not trading off on farming their camps, right? And one of the problems that is created when we have the version of the jungle that promises you that you can farm forever is I think it promises a fantasy that we can't deliver, which is that, oh, as the jungler, you can sit in your jungle for 20 minutes and emerge and become this monstrous carry, right? And the reality is we can't really pay off that promise, because if the jungle is a scaling role, the question is where you can acquire tons and tons of gold and experience, and that's something that we can actually and that's something we're actually paying off, which we have in previous seasons. The significant downside of that is that we kind of break the promise of the game, which is that people scaling have there's some way to counteract people scaling, right? Junglers can't be mitigated or pushed down in the same way that laners can, right? Like Kale and Cassidy are good examples of this. Like you can shut those champions down in lane, right? Not only just from a 1v1 perspective, but your team can act on those players to shut them down. It is significantly more difficult to do that to a jungler, right? And so a Master Yi that just goes into the jungle for 20 minutes and then comes out with 3 items and starts like just taking over team fights, there's a lot lower counterplay to that, and there's much lower standard of gameplay to that comparatively to a scaling laner who's just like a Victor who's sitting in mid lane and just farming up a storm and has 200 CS at 20 minutes, right? There's lots of things you could have done to stop that Victor from doing that thing. And maybe the Victor's better than you, and maybe that it was really, really difficult or impossible for you to do that, right? But it's like, but that took interactions and individual skill in those individual interactions for that Victor to get to that point. And there were lots of situations, lots of things that the Victor, like trade-offs that the Victor had to make to do that, right? And there are lots of things that had to go right for the Victor in order for that to happen. Whereas a lot of those things break down when you're talking about the jungle, where it's like, well, the jungler just sort of like walked around and hit their camps, right? And sure, theoretically, there's a world where like your support is constantly warding their camps, and you're invading as a 3-man with your mid laner, your jungler, and your support, and like pushing them off their camps and counter jungling them. It's like, but the barrier of execution there is substantially higher, and it's much, 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 much more difficult for us to promise a scaling fantasy in jungle, because the level of counterplay that is there to the jungler, like like scaling and farm, like scaling up purely through farm. The level of counterplay that is on offer there in the game in general is just much lower than it is in lane, and so we can't promise the same level of like hyper carry or like carry, like scaling carry fantasy in the jungle in the same way that we can in lane, unless it's dependent upon the jungler interacting with their opponents, right? This is one of the reasons why, like, while I don't like Kindred passive, marking generally, I think it does a good job of saying you have to take risks, you have to expose yourself to the enemy and offer them some counterplay to you in order to scale, and that means that Kindred can be really powerful late game, and that part works. Now, there's a lot of individual problems I have with Kindred's passive, right? But like, what I'm getting at here is that the fast respawn camp version of the jungle is essentially implicitly making a promise to players that we're not going to deliver on, because we have seen that world before and we know that that's really undesirable. Like, yep, this Hecarim just came out of the jungle at 20 minutes and he's running around killing everyone while being really like difficult to kill. He just has more items than everyone, right? Like, it's just like he's uninteractable, right? He just does his thing. Or the Master Yi or the Graves, or insert your favorite jungle power farmer. And so creating these clear windows of opportunity by tuning the camp, like the camp clear speed and the camp respawn timers, such that there is generally a window to interact. We create a time window where it's like, well, if you're a power farming jungler, you generally are going to sort of get more turns to interact without needing to worry about farming your camps. Like, the faster your clear speed, essentially, the more time you get to interact on the map without giving something up. But conversely, the champions that have slower clear speed, on average, are generally going to have better ganks, or they're going to do something else better. And so their time that they spend not farming, whether that's during that dead time or not, whether they're giving up a camp to get into that position or not, is more likely to convert into a kill, right? Like, when, using Udyr as an example here, it's like, yeah, Udyr clears faster than Jarvan, but Jarvan is way more likely to successfully execute a play on a gank. And so by creating this window of opportunity where both of them will be going for ganks, we create a situation where there's a clear advantage to being a faster clearer, where the Udyr gets more of that time to make those actions. But the Jarvan still has the advantage in making those actions, right? He's still better at ganking than the Udyr, and still more likely to succeed there, right? And so ultimately, I've only covered a couple of the top reasons, right? There, to be honest, there's more than what I'm talking about here, right? There's probably another like 3 or 4 like pretty meaningful reasons we have the camp timers tuned to where they are right now. Some of this also, by the way, is tuned to just like clear speed and like how many camps there are, right? Like, if we had more camps, the camp respawn timers would probably need to be slower, right? If we had fewer camps, they would probably need to be faster, right? Or we would need to tune the amount of time it takes to clear a camp. And so some of this also, by the way, is tuned into how quickly do players on average need to clear a camp for it to be satisfying, right? How much gold and experience do you need to get from a camp for it to be satisfying? And so there's a lot of different things tied up into like how satisfying clearing an average camp is, how much time it needs to take for it to be satisfying to clear a camp. There's a lot going on here. I'm not going to get into all of these things, partially because I'm not even really an expert on this space. I've worked a little bit on, tangentially on some of these, more so as an analyst, long in the past, back when I was on the game analysis team. But I've actually never done one of these as like one of these big jungle reworks as a designer. And so I'm not an expert on the space. And so I'm just sort of covering the sort of top reasons that that we've done this work and done some of these changes in the past. All of this having been said, I think there are lots of different constructions of the jungle. I think there are versions of the jungle where the camp respawn timers are slower. I think there's versions of the jungle where they could be faster. There's lots of different things that we could get at here, because a lot of this just has to do with other subjective sort of variable things in the jungle, like how tanky are the camps? How many camps are there, right? How often do the buffs spawn, right? Because as an example, if the buffs spawn more frequently, we'd probably want to spawn the camps a little bit less frequently, like the regular camps a little bit less frequently, because you would spend more time clearing your buffs on average. And therefore, to create the same amount of time window, right? Even if we wanted that exact same time window, we would need you to be doing the camp slightly less, and so on, right? So there's a lot of interrelated pieces here, such that I can't really give you like one definitive answer here. I've given you, again, some of the top reasons why I think it's good that they're constructed the way that the camp respawn timers are constructed the way that they are right now. But I can't give you a complete picture, because then I'd have to talk through like all of the positioning of all of the jungle things in general, and that would be like a probably multi-hour discussion on its own. And so hopefully this is a somewhat enlightening, like, oh, here's some of the things that this is related to. Here's some of the reasons why this is constructed the way that it is in the current game. But this doesn't mean that it won't change in the future, right? I think there's lots of different things we could do with the jungle in the future, and we haven't changed the jungle significantly in a while, and I think there are some things about the current jungle that aren't super amazing. I mean, the current jungle is pretty functional, but it's not to say that it couldn't stand to receive positive changes at some point in the future. So hopefully that's a good answer for you. Why don't tanks get much tenacity? So I think there's a lot of history here, right? One of the reasons why we historically avoided making tenacity items specifically for tanks was that mercs were so powerful, and so like boots in general were very, very, very powerful, right? And so one of the things that hinged the boot system was important for this decision making structure for tanks in the boot system was, do you want tenacity or not? Because otherwise tabbies are a pretty clearly very powerful thing, right? There's an 80 carry in almost every game. Tabbies are extremely powerful against attack-based damage. There's generally going to be at least one, often two or three of your opponents that are going to get mitigated. A lot of their damage is going to get mitigated by tabbies. And so one of the intentional trade-off points here was, well, when you need tenacity as a tank, you have to give up this really, really, really powerful effect, right? However, now that boots are a lot more powerful today than they have been in the past, I don't think that decision point is quite as weighty or as important for us to maintain to the same level of power or impact that we have in the past. And so I think there is actually more room for this. And as an example, I have tenacity on a tank item that was added this season. It's called Protoplasm Harness. Now, granted, it's not passively on the item. That was something that I heavily considered, decided against it at one point. But I do think there is room for a tank item that just has tenacity on it as a stat. In general, I do think that it is. I think we should be reconsidering tenacity on our items, especially in light of the fact that boots are just a lot weaker. In previous versions of the game, when tier 2 boots in general were just way more powerful than they are today, I think there was a lot of reluctance to do much in the way of tenacity in the legendary item system, just because of how warping that having that tenacity, access to that tenacity would be, especially in the early item slots for the decision points between different boots. But now that there's a lot less pressure on that tier 2 boots decision because the boots are just less powerful, I think that there's probably a lot more room for us to make tenacity items. And as an example, fighters have tenacity on Wit's End and Sterax. I think fighters, AD fighters, and also Endless Hunger, I think AD fighters should have access to tenacity. I don't think Sterax is the right place for it. I also don't think Wit's End is the right place for it. Honestly, even Endless Hunger might not be the right space for it, although I actually kind of like the tenacity on Endless Hunger a little bit more than the other two. I'm not 100% confident that's the right place for it. I generally believe that tenacity should be on second items, very easily purchasable second items that you can flex into more easily for fighters, as an example. And I think the same is probably true for tanks, right? One of the reasons why I think that tenacity probably shouldn't be on your first items is one of the things we've seen before when champions could stack Mercs plus Legend Tenacity when that was in the game, and the older versions of Unflinching that also gave Tenacity, was that leads to certain effects breaking down too early in the game, right? There are certain CC effects that it's totally okay if they stop working and stop doing the thing, some of the things that they do later on in the game, right? Like as an example, there are certain CC combos that are supposed to be reliable at the bare minimum early in the game. But when, as an example, you get light bindinged by Lux at 12 minutes into the game as Jax, and you have Merc's Legend Tenacity and the old Unflinching, and the Lux can't even hit you with her ultimate at 12 minutes. I think that's wrong, right? I think that's an example of just kind of a broken interaction that shouldn't happen too early in the game. Later on in the game, I think it's totally okay for stuff like that to occur, especially for champions that are heavily investing in that. But part of the problem with the runes, as an example, was that didn't actually represent a significant investment in tenacity, and you got them very early on in the game. It was very easy to stack up Legend Tenacity to high values, combine them with Mercs and the previous Unflinching. Anyway, we don't need to get into all of that. But generally speaking, I think that our current tenacity comes in in the item system for fighters comes in a little bit too late, and isn't on items that have freedom of choice, right? As an example, if we put tenacity on Shojin, I think that would actually be good for some champions. I'm not saying we should put it on Shojin, but that kind of choice structure where there's a lot of champions that can buy Shojin, but it's not necessarily the best thing for them, or it's not necessarily always the most exciting thing in their second slot, or even their first slot for that matter. But if we magically wave our wand and say Shojin is not a first purchase for any champion, it's the kind of item that I think could be a good holder for tenacity, where it's well, it's fairly generic. It's kind of hard to go too wrong with buying a Shojin. It's good on a lot of fighters, and a lot of them can buy it second, but they just don't, because they have other items that are a bit higher affinity for them or a bit higher synergy. Okay, putting tenacity on that kind of item could be reasonably compelling, because that means that in the games where you do need tenacity, you could opt for it, right? And wrapping back around to the tank case, I think that's kind of where we would want it. And so something like Unending Despair, as an example, I think might be a good candidate to just have some tenacity. I've also considered Unending Despair, for other spaces, right? Where it's like, well, Despair is not a particularly exciting first item, like the way that it scales and the way that it works. It's like generally outperformed by other armor items in the first slot. Um, and so it like, and it's presenting itself as like this is a team fight item, right? And so I think it having tenacity on it could be nice. In general, I do think that, like I said previously, we probably should reconsider like tenacity. Right, as an example, I also think there should be a tenacity item for AP fighters, right? Which currently just doesn't exist. Um, and in general, I think that we probably at some point should do some reconsidering around like how much tenacity should we have on legendaries, and how many of these should be stackable. Uh, do we actually want what percentage do we actually want? Is the right amount on mercs? Is the right amount on our items, right? Should legendaries have more, less, or the same amount as mercs, right? I think there's a lot of open questions that I think the answers are likely, well, it probably should be a little bit different from the way that they're structured right now. And in general, I think there's room for a tank item that just passively has tenacity on it. That having been said, if you do want some tenacity in the tank space, Protoplasm Harness does exist, which does give you tenacity during the effect, which is something, right? Obviously, it's not like, wow, this is going to help me a lot against like getting chain CC'd by Fiddlesticks or whatever, right? Or Lysandra or whatever the case might be. But it is there, and there is something, there is some value in that. And so, in general, I guess my overall response to this question is, tanks don't have much tenacity in their systems because of historical precedent and like our concerns around the weight in the tier, like the boots decision, and like how we'd be warping decision making in the boot system. Now that decision between tier 2 boots, because the tier 2 boots are less powerful, carries a lot less weight and is less important. um, I think that there's probably a bit of space for tanks to have some tenacity just passively on their items, or potentially as like part of an active, or part of some unique passive or whatever. Right, like we have one unique passive that gives them tenacity already on Protoplasm. Could potentially be more. I also think just in general that there are like more classes should probably have access to tenacity in the legendary item system, and I also think the slots that they have it on are probably not the right slots. I think that we should probably push it a little bit earlier, but probably not too much earlier. I think second item is about the right point. And so, yeah, I think that there's some potential room for improvement here in the tenacity on legendary space. Would you say that modern champion designs are less sharp than older ones? Talking specifically about Blitzhook versus Pikehook, Lilia Q and W having damage variants rather than just being all or nothing spells. I think to the core point of this question, I would say the answer is yes. There are more considerations than just like having core variants, though. Some of it is that we're more intentional about creating a wider variety of different outcomes when you interact with a champion, right? Like a good example of an older, very, very, very sharp champion, and one of the things that we probably wouldn't make today is like Cho'Gath. This is not saying Cho'Gath is bad, to be clear, right? But it's like Cho'Gath has this thing where it's like, well, he has Rupture, which is a really hard spell to land, his Q. When it lands, it's going to be really bad for the opponent a lot of the time. It's going to be really good for Cho'Gath, but it's very hard for him to actually land that spell on people because it's such a fair spell. And so that leads to these really extreme outcomes where it's like, oh, I've been leaning against Cho'Gath normally for 5 minutes, and then he hit me with one Rupture, and then he ran directly at me and killed me from full, or whatever, right? Like that's a situation I've personally seen multiple times. And things like that have to occur, right? It's like, and so some of it is, yeah, modern designs tend to not create those crazy outlier, like, not create those crazy outlier situations. Those can still happen, right? But more so, those crazy outlier situations are actually outliers and not the baseline expected gameplay of the champion, right? Whereas Cho'Gath, as an example, especially AP Cho'Gath is the more extreme version, right? But even tank Cho'Gath, right? You're laning as tank Cho'Gath top. There's a lot of situations where it's like, well, you're just laning normally, you get silenced and you get ruptured, and it's like, well, if the enemy jungler's here, you're just dead, right? Like you just die, like with nothing else you can do, and that's really the end of it, right? However, there is another factor to consider here, which is especially when you're talking about, like, I think Pikehook versus Blitzhook is a really good example case of when we made Pike, we knew that Pike's hook would definitively not be the best hook in the game, right? Blitzcrank is an example of a champion where there's a lot of power budgeting that comes into play here as well around when we make an effect that is very similar to, or in some cases, like has a lot of the same properties as a prior effect, right? Like we have multiple hooks in the game, right? We have Nautilus hook, we have Blitzcrank hook, we have Thresh hook, we have Pike hook. There's lots of hooks out there. Sort of Renata Q is also sort of a hook, right? Um, but when we make a spell that has a lot of similarities to a previous spell, we often don't want to like infringe upon the territory that other champions have unless it's like not a meaningful part of their power budget, right? As an example, it's like we have lots of spells that are basically just like Jinx W, right? Like we have lots of zaps in the game. And that's fine, right? Because Jinx is not about her zap. But when we make another hook, we do have to consider how that relates to Blitzcrank, because Blitzcrank definitively should have the best hook in the game, right? Like Blitzcrank is supposed to have the best hook. And so one of the reasons why we increased the range of Blitzcrank hooks, years ago was we came to the conclusion, hey, actually, Blitzcrank hook is not the best hook in the game. It's actually worse than some of these other hooks that we've made over the years, just due to the way that we've tuned these champions and the way the game has changed over the years. Blitzcrank does not have the most powerful hook. Well, he should have the most powerful hook, so we're going to make it better, right? And so we gave it more range in order to make sure that it was the best one. And so a lot of this applies to like you're making a new champion with that shares some space with an existing champion, and you need to make sure that if that champion like that is their core thing, you're not infringing upon that space. Like we wouldn't make a champion who, as an example, like is better at just purely running around and being a nuisance in teamfights than like Singed. Lilia is in a similar vein, but she does very different things, and she has some of her power concentrated in that specific like ult moment, which is really cool for her. But it's like the way that she runs around in teamfights and is a nuisance is very clearly like well differentiated from Singed, as an example, right? Even though they have very similar gameplay in a lot of ways, and of course it also helps that they're in different roles, and so that gives them a lot of different context around how they use their spells and all of that, and how they play teamfights and that kind of thing. Anyway, but a lot of this just comes down to like how we create kits. A really good example also is someone like Hui. Hui gets to have some really interesting spells that don't have to stand out super well on their own, because the core pattern of the character already makes those spells stand out naturally. Of just, well, you have 9 of them comparatively to the 3 that a normal mage would have. You can only cast 3 of them at any given time. Their cooldowns are tied together, right? But you have more options, and so even though like Hui QQ is not a particularly like super interesting or high variance spell, the fact that you have 3 options of spells to cast, you could have cast QW or QE instead, actually gives a lot of the depth and the softening of Hui as a character, which is compelling. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we won't make sharp characters, right? I would actually say that as an example of something that we made, like Smolder is a pretty sharp champion, right? Like especially the release version was even sharper. We softened him a little bit post-release, but the release version of Smolder was a very sharp character, and it's okay for us to make sharp characters today. But I will say, yes, it is generally true that modern designs are a little bit less sharp in that they have more variance in outcomes, partially because we're just more intentional about creating a variety of different outcomes, because that tends to be more interesting and rewarding for people who want to spend lots and lots of time playing a given champion, but also because newer champions are more likely to run into, hey, I want to do a specific thing, but some other champion is already doing that thing and is already supposed to be the best at that thing, or is already doing the thing in this specific way that I don't want to infringe upon. And so therefore, one of the ways that you can move away from that is, okay, well, I'm going to do that thing, but with variance, right? Or like where, sure, in the optimal case, I might do that thing as well as, this older, sharper champion, like a Fizz or a Syndra or whatever, right? But in the average case, I will be doing less. And the typical case, I will be doing something slightly different, right? Like Pike is a really good example where it's like, well, Pike doesn't even use his hook as a hook every single spell. Right? Like sometimes he just uses it as a stab, right? And you just shanks you, right? And you're slowed and you take a bunch of damage. And so overall, in response to this question, it's like, yes, I would say that that is the case, but it's not just for one specific reason that that's the case. There's I think a lot of different reasons. And again, this is another question where it's like, if you want a really great, like comprehensive answer to this question, go find August streaming and ask him, because I'm sure he'd have a better, even better answer than what I have here. I'm not a champion designer, and so this is not, my area of, primary expertise. Thoughts on letting Shyvana turn off her R early? So there are a couple of things that these kinds of thoughts immediately bring to my mind. Number one, the biggest one with any new input, especially an input that like cancels another thing that the champion is doing, is this a skill test that we actually want for the character? And with Shyvana, I think what a lot of people are thinking when they talk about stuff like this is, oh, what about the use case where like you are to escape or you are for a quick play, quick fight, whatever, and then you're going to go do a jungle camp, and it would be nice in theory if you could just repress your R and cancel it, and then start building your Fury towards your next ultimate, essentially like making your ult cooldown lower. And I have a question here around, is this the type of skill test that we actually value for Shyvana? Number one. And number two, is this where Shyvana players actually would want their power, right? Because it's not a lot of power, right? Like, I'm not saying this would be like a massive buff or anything, but it is real power, right? The fact that essentially your ult cooldown is lower in some situations if you opt into this specific skill test. And so when I look at those two questions, starting with the skill test part, I say, I'm not really sure this is a good skill test for Shyvana, right? For some players, sure, it would be, right? But the intended audience for Shyvana is not a player who's trying to optimize like their exact ult uptime, right? Or not the type of player who is most going to be invested in having a lot of different fiddly inputs that can be micro optimized, right? It's like, this is a champion who turns into a big dragon and flies into the enemy team and does a bunch of damage, right? The skill tests here are intended to be more straightforward on this champion and intended to be a lot about cycling your Qs and hitting your Es and positioning really well and figuring out how you approach fights, right? And I'm not really sure, like, to me, just on a surface level, this doesn't seem like the right type of skill test for this champion. From a power perspective, also, I kind of question, like, do we really want to put any power here, right? Like, is really what you want is that in some fringe scenarios, some like relatively narrow scenarios, you want a lower ult cooldown. Would you not rather just have higher Fury generation baseline? Like, say I could give you this buff. Like, let's just imagine, like, let's hand wave. Let's suppose Shyvana is getting a 1% buff. Again, I'm not saying these are the exact numbers. I'm just making stuff up here, right? But like, let's suppose Shyvana needs a 1% buff. Do you want this, or do you want just like higher baseline Fury generation, or like higher Fury generation from interacting with enemies? I feel like the ones that just where you just generate more Fury, and this would be more consistent, and your ult cooldown would just be more consistently lower on average. Those seem like more compelling places to have that type of power if we wanted our ult cooldown to effectively be lower. And so I find it difficult to see ways in which this makes a lot of sense for Shyvana. Of course, I get the point of like pain here that you're saying of like, oh, it does feel weird that having my dragon form on when I'm jungling is like just a disadvantage. To that end, I would say like maybe we need to make dragon form more clearly good at doing jungle camps, and so you don't feel as bad about that, right? Because that doesn't really like that level of power seems like relatively minor, and like maybe we could just make the Q3 feel really good against jungle camps, like just do bonus damage there, and that's something that's really exciting. Is I like, instead of feeling like you're being penalized, you actually get to be excited about like, oh, finally, I'm in a situation where I get to do a jungle camp really fast as Shyvana, like dragon form. And so to me, I think I get the underlying pain point, but to me, I don't think this is the correct solve. Partially because I think some of the optimizations that you would need to get into with this seem like they're pretty undesirable around like, oh, what about like the tail end of a team fight where you are planning on wrapping around and going for like a flank on the remaining three members of the enemy team or something like that. And it's like, well, actually, you should cancel your R early and like hit a scuttle crab on your way around on this long flank or something like that. And it's like, is that really the optimization that we want for Shyvana players to be like thinking 30 to 30 minutes 30 seconds to 1 minute ahead of time around like how you're going to be playing super far ahead of times? Like, are those the kinds of optimizations we want for Shyvana players? Is that the kind of skill test we want? My suspicion is no. And so my inclination here is, it's not that Shyvana, like, that I'm saying that all reactivations are bad or anything like that, right? I want to be clear, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that like Shyvana could never have a skill skewed mechanic or anything of that kind. It's just, I look at this specific combination of like canceling R early on Shyvana, and I just find myself skeptical that that's worth the price in both power and in term like the type of like, or that the type of skill test is correct here. I think is the way that I see this. Samira itemization. Is there a gap in the crit first items for niche champs? And this point that was being made here was that, hey, collector first isn't always good. Shield bow ends up at 75% crit, right? Because the natural progression of the other items in crit, if you don't go collector, is some combination of shield bow, infinity edge, and then a last whisper item, right? And because Samira doesn't really care about attack speed, and she also doesn't really care about attacking people. She's not going to buy a Zeal item. She's not going to buy a Hex Optics, right? And so there's not many options really left over for her in the crit space. And the way that I look at this is that it is, I would say, something that maybe could be improved on the crit itemization side. But I actually think this is more of a issue with Samira where she scales with too few things, or she cares about too few things in the item system, and she's maybe even a little bit overly bound to crit in the current system, in the current game, where I think it should actually be more functional, more viable for her to do something like, say, Bloodthirster first, right? The fact that that's so much less powerful than buying crit, and like so much of her damage is tied to crit, right? There are upsides, of course, to her tying her damage very heavily to crit, but I think that also does limit the way that she's itemizing. And the reality is the crit system is built for auto attackers, right? And so when we put Samira in the crit system, and then we say, by the way, you don't actually attack to deal your damage, that's going to produce some problems, right? We've had similar problems in the past with other subclasses that we've been able to resolve over the years, right? Like, as an example, I think if you go back far enough into the past, you look at someone like Singed, it's kind of like, well, this champion is not really supported by the item system, doesn't really have the right items to buy. And we've added a lot of items over the years to support champions like Singed, or champions with shapes like Singed, right? And Samira, I think, has the case of, hey, you're in this item system, but you're not doing the thing that the champions that normally build these items do. And that comes with some consequences, right? Neela, I think, has a similar problem where she also, I think, has some pretty awkward itemization around the crit system. But at least she auto attacks, right? And that does help, and that does give her some release valves, and that like gives her a little bit of leeway there. But I think that realistically speaking, to me, part of what this speaks to is I think Samira is maybe a little bit too crit dependent, number one. And number two, I also think that there is maybe some space for us to lean a little bit back more heavily and like let Samira get a little bit more access to like the caster crit items, right? As an example, we saw a lot of like poor things resulting from specifically like Samira's R applying on hits in development, right? We tried that. But I think like imagine a world where her Q applies on hits and suddenly something like Essence Reaver might actually be really attractive, and that might open up an extra option for her, right? Because haste actually isn't, it's not like it's like unplayable to get some haste on Samira. And so I think to me, there are maybe some things we could open up, right? Like maybe we could get her a little bit down the caster 80, like a caster crit pathway. And maybe that's just something we could open her up to. Or maybe there's another way we could, maybe there's a way we could find her, to get her interested in like Hex Optics. Like imagine if her R radius scaled with her attack range, for example, right? Like maybe Hex Optics is really exciting then. Things like that, I think, are small ways we could open her up to additional items. But overall, I kind of look at this and I say, like, I guess the crit item system could have another AD crit item, but like, who else is going to be interested in that besides Samira specifically? And if it's an item that doesn't care about your attacks, what is that item doing, right? And so I kind of look at this, and my conclusion is maybe the crit item system could handle this case a little bit better. But I'm much more inclined to look at Samira because I really do think Samira is the only champion that really suffers to like a high degree here, right? Because the other champions I think that build most similarly, like most comparably to Samira, which are champions like Draven, MF, and Neela, all have other tie-ins to this, like to either other systems or other parts of the crit system, such that they do not ever run into this case where it's like, well, Draven, if you run into this situation, it's like, well, RFC is probably really good, right? Like Draven is not unhappy to have an RFC, or insert a number of other items that are like clearly like at least functional on Draven if you just want to hit 100% crit, and so on. Same thing for like a lot of these other champions, right? Like with MF, for example, it's like hitting 100% crit is not the highest priority on that champion, and you can just buy some random lethality items. That's fine. Same thing with Draven, right? And so to me, I think what this speaks to is maybe a little bit of over reliance upon crit scaling for Samira, and maybe a little bit of like a little bit of lack of systemic ties to the things that like to the things that crit actually applies to on typical champion kits, I suspect, is kind of how I look at this. Last question for today. Could an item have no build path? I think that the answer to this is yes, but my question is why, right? A lot of the answers to questions like open-ended questions like this of like, is this thing possible? It's like, yeah, I could imagine a world where we really want to make, for whatever reason, we want a really like powerful greed item spike that costs 2,200 gold, and you have to store up tons and tons and tons of gold in order to be able to get this, because we for some reason want there to be more snowballing for like a specific class or something like that, right? It's like, I don't think that kind of situation is very likely, but I could imagine something like that, and that would be one method by which we could accomplish that kind of thing. Is tell a specific class, here's a powerful item that requires you save up a lot of gold at the same time, which requires you to sacrifice or be really ahead, or make big trade offs in order to get that, whatever, right? I think in general, I kind of look at this and I say the idea feels like one of those like designer thought experiments of what does this actually do to the game? And then when I think about the actual gameplay, I come to the conclusion, well, we're losing a lot of the satisfaction of building towards your item, and we're heavily rewarding you for storing like tons and tons and tons of gold in your inventory. So it's probably really snowbally. It's probably really rewarding for people who are specifically extremely far ahead, and probably really inaccessible to anyone who's not super far ahead. And I think about those qualities and I say, hard to imagine a world where we're actually trying to tap into exactly that combination of properties. But I'm not saying it's impossible, right? The reality is like, I think what people imagine when they say things like this is, oh, I really want a 3,000 gold item. I can just sacrifice and trade off and like get beaten down and I'm going to access this huge 3,000 gold power spike and I'm going to come back from behind. And it's like, actually the reality is you would just never buy this item unless you were already really far ahead and you're stomping. And it's a way to turn a big advantage in the game into a guaranteed win. And that's likely to be the main use case of the item. And obviously, there's ways we could try to subvert or mitigate those things, but that's the kind of baseline state. And this is something where the concept on its own is sort of interesting from an intellectual perspective, but is lacking a lot of what I would consider to be the like actual visceral satisfaction around items of like building them up from the build path and actually getting into like the excitement of like or the interest in like deciding between different items on the build path, or like when you're going to base to get the breakpoints on the item and things like that. It's like degrading, I think, a lot of the interest in the item system to have something like this. And so again, well, I don't think it's impossible, and we could maybe come to a conclusion that there's a really good space for it for whatever combination of reasons. I can imagine some of that things happening. I think it's pretty unlikely that you'd ever see anything like this in the way that we currently use the item system, because of the downsides that any item in this in this structure would really have. Anyway, that's going to be it for today. This is number 33. Thanks everybody for watching. Didn't get too many questions in this one. Spent a lot more time per question. I know some people do really like that, so hopefully you enjoyed watching. As per usual, thank you for watching, and maybe catch you in the next one, number 34.